It has been asked of me often. I have learned all the steps of perspective, but when I go to put together an environmental drawing, a landscape, an architectural rendering that is a part of my narrative scene, somehow it always ends up looking more like a perspective exercise and less like an actual inclusive environment. How do I go about taking my perspective knowledge and now applying it to my art? First, I think it's important to remember why we learn perspective. And it's the same reason why we learn anatomy or why we learn landscape painting. It's so that we gain a familiarity in the subject matter so that way when we go back to it into our art, we are more capable of creating such things and then being able to modify such things for the sake of the design or the sake of our own unique invention. When it comes to perspective, the same is true. The idea of learning perspective is to hopefully not get yourself bogged down in a bunch of geometric formulas that are required for understanding how to triangulate your space, but instead to have an intuitive sense of the spatial relationships that occur in front of you. That way, when you go to concept, it comes more naturally to you which way those lines should be going and how things diminish in space as they move away from you, as well as those proportional relationships. That is the key. I would say the number one key in being able to get your perspective to become more immersive is first to just become a master of perspective. But even beyond that, there are some quick little steps that I will demonstrate that will help you achieve this effect for yourself. So let's go through those steps. So what I have right here is I have a very rough thumbnail. Remember, if perspective is more intuitive to you, so if you have some practice in doing it, your thumbnail process should go fairly smoothly when it comes to putting together these ideas. But they're still very rough. It's still kind of generally hashed out. You kind of know where to point your lines, but they're not exact. You kind of know what the grid will look like, but it's not exact. But it's enough where you can at least envision your space. So this is my space that I created. It's a classroom, basically. I'm going to be designing a classroom setting. So yes, a lot of it comes from my prior perspective knowledge, but a lot of it also comes from research. Ahead of time, I've gone and I've looked up pictures of the interiors of classrooms, both photographs as well as other illustrations. So I have kind of a sense of what the space looks like. And that's important. If you don't know what your interior space looks like or your exterior space, it becomes more difficult to concept that into your thumbnail drawing. So I looked up some schoolyard settings. So that kind of informed my process. And then I created a series of thumbnails actually. And this is the one that I decided to go with. So here's my really rough thumbnail. As you can see, it's pretty brutal. I will take this thumbnail then, and I will then go and print it out. And sometimes I'll do this digitally, but I like to work more traditionally at this stage because number one, my paper is less slippery than my Cintiq monitor. And number two, I can draw straight lines very quickly with a ruler. That's kind of difficult to do in Photoshop. So I'll take my thumbnail drawing, I will print it out. The next step is I need to establish my horizon line and my vanishing points. I kind of already know where my horizon line is because I've already predetermined it and when I did my thumbnail. And it's kind of 2/3 up on my sheet of paper. And I have some starting lines right here. So I'll kind of follow these lines. This is 1-point perspective, so it's a lot easier in 1-point perspective. So I'll follow these lines that I've drawn right here until they converge at a singular point. And I'll recorrect any other lines that exist in this drawing so that that way they're all going to that singular point. And this just kind of solidifies the space that I have already created for myself. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just very quickly drop in a grid just to make sure that everything that I've drawn is working out correctly. And in this particular case, one of the grids I'm going to draw out is going to help me determine what that back wall should look like as well as that door. The average size of a door is 3 feet by 7 feet. And so I use that knowledge. I'm going to base the rest of my perspective on that door that I have on this back wall right here. So I'm going to measure out that door and then I'm going to build out the rest of my grid from there. And so along the baseline, I can make marks that are equal to the marks that I put on my door. And that gives me marks for the start of my grid. I need to determine where my diagonal measuring point is by establishing a standing position, which is in line with my center of gravity, which is in line with my singular 1-point vanishing point. all of that is connected. If you've gone through the process of learning perspective, you know this. Once I have my diagonal measuring point, then I can construct the rest of my grid in 1-point perspective. And so this is going to give me now my floor grid. Now I have all these desks in place. So on the floor grid, I'm going to map out the footprint of all my desks. So that's the next thing I do. And so as I go through this process, some things are going to get corrected that are different from my original thumbnail drawing, and that's all right. That's what the grid is there for. So then I'll correct all of the footprints of my desks, and you can see I've eliminated one row of desks because it's just too close to the back wall. You'll see that I've made a few adjustments to that back wall to make sense with the space. Also, I've run into some awkward tangents and alignments that I don't like, so I'll make some adjustments whenever that happens. And then once I have mapped out the footprints of all my desks, then I need to elevate those desks, and I'm going to use the height of my doorway on that back wall to tell me how high up I need to take my desks. So if my doorway is 7 feet tall, then my desks need to be about 3 feet tall. So I'll use 3 tick marks up, and that's where I will elevate my desks to. So I draw lines up from the floor, and then I'll draw the tops of my desks. Now I'm getting a lot of lines. You can see there's a lot of lines all over the place. So I'm going to use my blue pencil to indicate the top of my desk. So I know that these are the boxes that are going to remain, the tops of the desks. Everything else underneath, I'm going to modify as I draw, but this is what remains. And so I want to be able to see the top of the desk very clearly. So that's why I use the blue. So once I've done that, then I'm going to take a sheet of marker bond. I'm going to put it on top. And then I'm going to just start drawing in all of the details. Another thing that's helpful if you want to kind of keep your piece from looking too perspective-y, if you will, is have fun with some of your lines. Yes, you create the grid, and the grid creates structure. But then when you go to put your actual final lines on top, it's okay to curve those lines. It's okay if those lines are a little bit shaky. You'll notice that oftentimes that once I have created my grid, and when I do create my grid, I use my rulers, my triangle, and everything, make sure everything is perfect. But then once I create my grid and I draw my long lines, I will draw those lines freehand. I won't use a ruler. I like kind of the variance that I get with my hand. My hand shakes a little bit. I like some of those little shakes showing up into my line. That also helps to keep it from looking so much like a perspective exercise. Through a variety of those steps, once you have your grid in place, populating it with your people, populating it with your detail, having fun with your line. Your line doesn't always have to meet to the very perfect point and everything else that you've already calculated, as long as the structure is in place. I like to say a confident line is better than a perfect one. So be confident with your lines, and you should have that confidence if your grid is correct, and just drop them in there. Again, get some good reference. You'll notice on the bottom of my desks, I didn't really fully grid out everything about those desks. I just kind of freehanded it. So that helps it look more natural. And also gives me the freedom just to add detail upon detail upon detail upon detail. If you had to grid all of that out, it can make you go crazy. I know it makes me go crazy. But I could already have a basic structure in place, so that I can just follow that structure as I add additional detail. So I hope you found that very helpful. My name is Benjamin Hummel. I am the Perspective Professor, and stay tuned for additional videos and tutorials on perspective, and be sure to go to Art Studio Nation to find out about future classes that I will be teaching on perspective, as well as the perspective book that I am currently writing that will hopefully be out pretty soon.